Hello, this is a narrated artist talk that I put together in February of 2023 about my newest work and how it all evolved and converged. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, I'm James Thurman, and this is a brand new artist talk that I put together that explores the evolution of my studio work and the convergence of different themes, concepts, materials, and processes as they've all come together into my newest work. So my newest series, which at the time of recording this presentation, I haven't even put up on my website yet, is called the Sweet Series. And it brings together different approaches I've taken with a variety of different ways of working in my studio. So my background in metalsmithing and jewelry making, metal spinning approaches, wood turning, Thurmanite, my layered recycled paper material that I developed that I'll talk about a bit more, as well as more recently including painted miniatures in the pieces. So this piece out of the Sweet series is called Repercussions, and it actually brings together a couple different pre-existing series I have. One of them is the Morality series, where I'm focusing in on different deadly sins and heavenly virtues, as well as my Vessel plus Wearable series, where I create small vessels that act as homes for wearable jewelry pieces when they're not on the body. It also incorporates a focus I've had on aquatic imagery and themes. And this particular piece, the lid of the vessel, which is also a large wearable ring, is made from Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And then when not being worn, it sits on that spun pewter vessel where I've fabricated the little brass portholes for it. And the base, and actually the lid as well, is made from Thurmanite, which is layered recycled paper that I've then turned and shaped on the lathe. Here you see the piece being worn, and in that center image you can see those subtle ripples that seem to be emanating from the deep sea diver walking on the top of the piece. The image in the upper right is the inverse of the wearable ring that also serves as the lid, where you have a sea creature's tentacle emerging out of hand-painted kind of collage referencing the ocean and waves. So let's start back at the beginning, see where all these things emerged back from, and I promise that it'll all tie in and all relate. So don't get nervous that I'm starting with something I made when I was 7 years old. This is obviously an early piece of mine, but it's a drawing that is still important to me, that I have around in the studio, and I'm thankful that my mom was quite the archivist and kept a lot of my drawings and even captioned them like this one. So if you see in the corner of the drawing on the back, it says, "What I will be 20 years from now." So it's one of those typical sort of "what will I be when I grow up" drawings. And I kind of remember the process of doing this, and throughout my life I've been drawn to often opposing kind of influences or paths, and had kind of an internal conflict that I've wrestled with trying to resolve at different points that you'll see kind of keep cropping up. So in this one, with the prompt of sort of what do I want to be when I grow up, I was obviously drawn to the arts, as a lot of children are, and you see the one drawing with an artist painting a portrait outside in a sunny day. But if you notice, there's also sort of a little dark boot there. And I remember trying to fit these two ideas together. And so the other idea that I was kind of drawn to was something in the sciences. My dad is a mechanical engineer, and I feel that there's some part of me that's similar to that in how I approach problem solving. And it didn't make sense to kind of draw the artist and the scientist together, so I literally flipped the paper over and drew my idea of a scientist on the other side. So you see the guy in the lab coat and the beakers and test tubes with colorful liquids and things like that. So I come back to this drawing a lot because I feel that I move between these two kind of modes of approaching problems and coming up with solutions. So skipping ahead a little bit, this is the first piece that I ever won an art award for. So it was a little fantasy lead figure miniature that I painted when I was 13 years old and got a little award from the local game shop and everything. But it was really something that got me thinking that, well, maybe I could continue in the arts and have a career in that. And I remember also at the time, moving into my teenage years, I had been, playing Dungeons and Dragons with my childhood friends and everything, and was starting to feel maybe a little bit embarrassed about that I should grow up and let go of those kind of childhood games and everything. So again, this was kind of an internal conflict that I wrestled with and that I'll return to as you'll see. So skipping ahead a little bit, I ended up pursuing a BFA in sculpture from Carnegie Mellon University, and this was when I started realizing that I could use found objects and materials in my finished artworks. And this piece here that's called Supplication on the right was actually the first time that I learned about epoxy resins and started incorporating resins into my work. It's also a body of work where I was starting to realize that I could incorporate kind of larger themes and concepts and meanings into my work. And so growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, not my parents' generation, but the generation before was very involved in the labor movement. Most everyone was employed either in the steel mills or in the railroads supporting the steel mills. And I was kind of exploring and reconciling some of that family history that I had. So a lot of the work I was doing related to going to those now closed and abandoned steel mills, liberating materials from those sites, taking photographs, still doing my own darkroom developing and chemical photography processes on my own, and matching those images of those sites with materials from those sites. And so that was kind of the work that I concentrated in my BFA, which aesthetically has changed a bit, but you'll see the roots of a lot of other themes that I continue to explore. So I was leaving my undergraduate education and not entirely happy with my awareness of the field of contemporary sculpture and contemporary art. I felt it was so wide open that you could do anything, and I was already drawn to metalworking, and I was becoming really interested in craftsmanship. And fortunately, I had a connection with Boris Bally. He was actually my 3D foundations teacher, and he was looking for a studio assistant, and I was finishing up school, and so ended up working for him. And he gave me a huge amount of training on the job. I was not aware that metalsmithing was a field. Carnegie Mellon didn't have specific focus on metalsmithing or jewelry making or anything like that. And so it really clicked for me that some sort of practice within the contemporary craft arena would really let me combine those interests in material processes, craftsmanship, as well as concepts. It was also great to work with someone who had an interest in resonance with found object materials. So if you're not familiar with his work, he does a lot with recycled street signs. And I was brought on to really help in the production of those. And so I started off doing really production raising and hammer forming of those street sign bowls. And then as he moved to having them spun, I learned about the process of metal spinning and became kind of a project manager on that, where I would take those blanks that were spun and refine them and help with the assembly and things like that. But this was really my introduction to working with different kinds of lathes, either machining lathes or spinning lathes. And there was something I was just inherently drawn to with those rotational processes. So I was in the process of developing my body of work to apply for graduate school. I had decided that I really wanted to be a teacher at a university or college, and wanted to get my MFA to do so, but really needed to create a new body of work that was different from what I was doing in my sculptural BFA. And so you see here some of the pieces that I was working on towards that. And so you see Still the rusty steel from my Pittsburgh heritage coming into some of the pieces, but starting to learn different jewelry making processes, starting to get really excited about hole joining techniques, still working with found objects and materials. The piece on the right, the divided piece, was one of Boris's first decommissioned gun show invitational shows in the Imagine series, if you're familiar with those. And so this piece called Divided uh, has a statistic about gun violence stamped on each one of those rods that's hanging each one of those large pendants that has a section of the decommissioned or recycled handgun on it. So as a way that I could combine my interest in having my work connect to a larger theme or meaning, as well as work with different jewelry making and metalworking techniques and incorporate those found objects. And just in case the art school thing didn't work out, I was going to night school and got certified as a machinist. And this is just a little shot of the school where I was going and doing that. And so I was definitely the odd man out with working on, wearable rings that were machined on a lathe and things like that. So I was fortunate in getting accepted to the metalsmithing program at Cranbrook Academy of Art and received my MFA there under Gary Griffin. And I really had the opportunity to have a lot more hands-on training and experience with doing metal spinning of my own. And in putting this presentation together, I realized that in the evolution of Gary's own work, that there were significant shifts and evolutions to where you see a neck piece on the left from his earlier, much more cleaner, minimal, machined aesthetic kind of approach to jewelry, and then a more recent piece of a more representational and narrative steel forged and fabricated gate piece. So you can see a dramatic shift in the kind of work, and maybe part of that made me feel a little bit better about some of the significant changes and evolutions that my own work has gone through. And in case you're not familiar with metal spinning, I just wanted to show kind of a short video of how that works. And so it's a forming process, sort of like throwing pots on a wheel, as opposed to a subtractive process like machining where you're carving away the metal. And so you can see this overhead shot of me working on my lathe here, and you can see that large burnisher tool, and that while the flat metal disc is spinning, using the tool rest and the fulcrum of that tool pin to press that burnisher up against the spinning disc and slowly shaping it into the form of a vessel that I might need for a particular piece. So that's just kind of, you may or may not have seen different kinds of videos, but for the hands-on, one-of-a-kind metal spinning that I do, most nearly all of it is done in this very similar kind of process. And while I was at Cranbrook and in graduate school, I was really fortunate to be able to take a workshop with wood turning master John Jordan and learned more than I could ever apply in different ways of approaching wood turning. And so I originally took the workshop so that I could get better at making tools for metal spinning, and then realized that this was a material and a process that I really enjoyed and wanted to incorporate into my finished pieces. So as I came back to Cranbrook for that second year, really started combining those spun metal pieces. You see some of the double-walled vessel series that I had, and then combining those in with finished wood components as well. And this was also a return to using some of the epoxy resins as partially a surface finish. So I would do the wood turning and the metal spinning and some deep sandblast etching onto some of the woods, and then do a final finish of epoxy resin over that, both to stabilize the wood as well as give it just a unique surface finish. So I want to get into this Thurmanite material that I ended up working with and developed, and where it came from. And so after getting my MFA at Cranbrook, I was fortunate to get a full-time teaching position at Penn State University. And while I was there, I was sharing an on-campus studio with a colleague who was a printmaker and artist bookmaker, and we were approached about designing awards for an environmental design symposium. And he had had a lot of old, recycled, used books that he would use and give to students either for student projects, and it seemed to us to make sense to recycle those books and make an award that would also be functional. So we did these series of candlesticks that were just all bolted together and made from sections of the books that we bandsawed and drilled and bolted there. And it was a wonderful project, something unlike anything I would have ever done on my own, and I greatly value the collaborative process for that. And something else that happened through that is as we were cutting through the books and making these components that we'd assemble, I saw what really seemed to me to be like wood grain of the books, and there was some kind of cyclical concept there that was really enticing to me, where okay, books come from wood. Wood has a natural growth grain to it. And then in recycling and cutting through the books again, you're re-exposing this kind of grain through the printing structure. And there was just something that I felt had so much potential there and was just so exciting. And even though I was a metalsmith, I just couldn't resist the seduction of it. So here's the current work that I was doing coming out of Cranbrook, and figuring out, all right, well, how, if I'm going to do this work on my own, does it make sense? And so what made sense to me was to, make larger blocks of material that were all glued together and that I could put onto the lathe and shape. And so this is some of those early pieces that I did as I was experimenting with different types of papers, different recycled books, different types of adhesives, and figuring out that wood glue was definitely not the way to go. It didn't dry completely, and I would turn a little bit on the lathe and have to wait for the glue to dry and harden up again as it was exposed to air. And it was even more labor intensive than you could imagine, just having to glue each one of those pages together and then still wait for the drying process while I'm working on it. But even despite all those technical challenges, I really continued to be excited about the patterns that were resulting from the process. And you can see little bits of the text kind of exposed through the layers, and then the side pattern that might look a bit like wood grain or even kind of DNA coding. There just seemed to be so much history there in the materials and so much potential to exploit both conceptually and aesthetically. And so continued with that kind of scientist side of my mind, with experimenting and changing variables and trying to figure out what adhesives worked best, what types of paper worked best. I wanted to introduce some color, and so this was the first piece that I ever made with maps. And so you can see that you're still getting a little bit of the fragments of the text, but also a wonderful variety of different color to it. And I realized that most papers just have the printing on the surface of the paper. And so what you're seeing is as that little white stripe that's going around each layer is the actual thickness of the paper as I'm cutting through it and going down to the next layer. So each layer has the ink that's printed on the surface of the paper, and then that white that's the inside of the paper, and then the printing again of the other side of the paper or the next layer of the paper. And so understanding how that structure worked and how I could best exploit it as I designed larger pieces, and scaling up from smaller kind of jewelry experiments to larger lathe-turned plates. And I was getting experience and getting an idea of how pieces might turn out, but was still just enraptured with the process because there were so many happy accidents, so many things that I couldn't exactly predict, and that while I was working on pieces, different patterns would emerge, and it just, each piece that I made, I would be working on the lathe, stop it, examine the patterning that would result, trim off just a little bit more, and really just be happily surprised with how all the different aspects of the piece might come together. And then sometimes I would keep the pieces with their source material. And so here you see an old anatomy textbook and the plate that resolved from it. I have maybe a bad sense of humor with puns and everything. And so a lot of these pieces I would call paper plates because they were plates made out of paper, and I would keep them with their source book as a container for it, and then also kind of a connection so that people that were less familiar with the material could understand how it was resolved and where it came from. And so you can see kind of this lighter stripe through here. If you looked through the book, you would see that that was the column of texts, and that was the gap in between those two columns. And so depending on where those pieces were from, you would see little slices of the text as well as imagery of the pieces too. And I just loved how they started combining and coming together. And throughout this whole process, I continued to kind of self-identify as a metalsmith and a jeweler, and so didn't want to do just wood turn pieces, but would continue with jewelry. And so this is an example of an earlier kind of Thurmanite ring that I made with a sterling silver interior sleeve to make it very wearable and very, very functional. But as you zoom in really on the details, you can even see some of the printing pattern dots of the different layers of each piece. And each time I worked with the material, there was just new discoveries, and that continued to sort of trigger that internal experimental scientist in me too. There's still some designs that I continue to make or do commissions of. These are very functional money or dollar rings, taking strips of currency and laying them into a sterling silver channel ring. So you can kind of identify little bits of the printing from the currency. I also liked this design particularly as kind of a reference to a lot of jewelry being made as a form of display of wealth. And so in this case, why not just literally wear your wealth? And this is another more playful kind of design that I continue to make, where with construction paper, and by this point, people are aware of me working with recycled papers and are starting to donate unused piles and reams of paper that might be left over. And so starting to play, in this case, with construction paper, where the color of the paper is mixed all the way through it. And so it has a very different kind of patterning as opposed to the printed kind of maps or books or something like that. And working with the material and even wearing it, it kind of looks like stone sometimes, but also is very light and durable. And so it's somewhere in between a plastic and a wood. And continuing with one-of-a-kind pieces, pairing the Thurmanite up with different other layered materials. So in this layered synergy series, combining it with Damascus steel. And I thought the patterns of either the layered paper Thurmanite plays off really wonderfully with the different metals layered together in the Damascus steel. And I was also asked about making cabochons from Thurmanite so that others could design jewelry around it. And so I figured if I'm making it for other people, I could make it for myself as well. And so the Layered Energy series incorporates a variety of different Thurmanite cabochons that I've made and then will incorporate into the pieces. And one thing that I really love about it is, since it's worked like wood, where you can more easily just drill through it, you can do other things that might be a lot more difficult with other kinds of stone cabochons, as far as drilling holes through it and doing a tube setting right within the stone or something like that. And I have continued on with different plate explorations. And so there was a series of kind of inspirations to me personally. And so this one example, giving tribute to Charles Rennie Mackintosh, the architect, and laser etching a inspired border pattern of his into a larger plate, where I've recomposited the different texts and maps and then also making some stands, since I am a metalsmith after all and like to incorporate the metalworking too. So a fold form stand for a series of these plates I think plays off nicely with the other aspects of the piece. And my vessel plus wearable pieces, I always kind of wondered, what do we do with jewelry when it's not on the body? And being someone that likes to make jewelry as well as smaller vessels, I thought this was a great combination where in this series, the jewelry could sort of live as a lid of the vessel when it's not on the body. And so that lid of the vessel here is a brooch with some wood inserts put through it before being lathe turned, and then the base vessel or the display vessel for it is metal spun pewter that I've continued to work on, and that's the part of that series. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of trademarking the material. So in the beginning, I wasn't really sure what to call this material because I was just experimenting, and it seemed like layered recycled paper bonded together with a plant-based resin was really quite a mouthful. And if I wanted other people to work with Thermonite, which was kind of a dream of mine, I'd really need to come up with kind of a more digestible, easy to say name for it. And so it kind of started off as a joke and actually went ahead and pursued it legally to register the trademark name of it. And in that way, it made it very simple for others to indicate what the material was if they were listing those materials in their own work. And my wife, Umut Demirguç Thurman, is also a jeweler and metalsmith and enamelist. And she was really the first person to collaborate with me on working with Thermonite. And this was a piece we did for a curated exhibition about partnerships and weddings and marriages. And so the centerpiece is an enameled component that Umut made, and then matching those kind of colors and patterns of the enameling with a lathe-turned map Thermonite ring around it. And that's just the top view of the ring. But this was kind of an early collaborative experience, and really got me much more motivated and excited about other people's working with the material. And this was the first piece through our collaboration that ended up becoming my vessel plus wearable piece, where for one of the World Championship belt buckle competitions, we collaborated on this design where she had a larger enameled vessel and then designing and making this larger belt buckle lid for it. So then the belt could live inside of the vessel when not being worn. And I was approached about providing Thermonite for this kind of unique custom game die manufacturer. And these were the first people to CNC machine the Thermonite as well as laser etch it. And it's not exactly a collaboration, but through those processes, I always am learning and trying new things because of what other people are working on. And so this really pushed my goal forward of other people starting to work with Thermonite and try things that I would never imagine even trying to do. And so that's what led me to curate this traveling exhibition called Paper Alchemy. And I had wanted people to work with it, and a few people over the years had, and I just wanted to take some initiative, and I curated a couple other exhibitions and had really enjoyed that process. And I thought, well, why don't I just reach out to great jeweler and metalsmith friends that I know and see if they'd be willing to try out working with Thermonite. And it's been a fantastic experience. The exhibition debuted with 13 different people's work in Istanbul, Turkey back in June of 2021. And it has continued to expand. There's now more than 45 different people have been involved in the show with more than 50 artworks. And there's just such a great range of things that I myself might never be making, but I was just so happily surprised with all the thoughtfulness, creativity, and energy that people put into their different pieces. You could see such a wide variety of different types, mostly jewelry, but also some vessels. And it's continued to travel, and there's been a variety of different venues. After seeing online the response that we got from that first show in Istanbul, many more people approached me and asked if they could join that show, and sent them more Thermonite and included them. And that's when at Radford University expanded it up to about 38 different artists, with some of them doing multiple pieces. And also traveled to Lighthouse Art Center. And every place that hosts the exhibition has obviously different kinds of approaches and exhibition designs. And many times I've been able to visit in person, or at least kind of zoom in and do talks and answer questions about the show and how it came to be, and the different people's works. And here's a listing of the current venues that it's all traveled to. And it's currently at the Floyd Center for the Arts while I'm recording this presentation, and many more venues are in the work. So we'll just see how long we can kind of keep it on tour, and see how much more interest we can generate in the project. And I did want to return to sort of an explanation about my own shift with my work to more explicitly narrative work. And there's a variety of factors that influence this. And it was both current politics, times of reflection through COVID, and then also some pretty significant personal experiences. And so one thing is, I live in Denton, Texas, where University of North Texas is, and we have a very active and visible flat earther in our community. And this is a picture of his house and his car that he drives around. And it's something that I see nearly every day. And it was kind of mind-boggling to me that we can be in the 21st century and still be wrestling with these kinds of ideas and concepts, and combining that with the election of Trump that I never would have foreseen or imagined. And so I do have to give credit that flat earther inspired this piece, which is Monsters at the Edge of the World, where another Thurmanite plate that I laser etched historic designs of sea monsters from ancient maps, and combined with another fold form sort of stand. But this was the first time that I actively included ideas of monsters into my pieces. And, like I mentioned, it was a long-standing interest that I had way back from childhood. But it conceptually started becoming something that was really interesting to me. And if you read much into theories or writings about the idea of the monster or the monstrous, and relating to different societal divisions, senses of otherness, exclusion, prejudices, and it just seemed that there was a lot of other things happening in current times where it made sense. Even though these particular images are taken from ancient historic maps, it still seemed to have a connection that made sense and was relevant to me at the time. So during COVID, went in for an annual checkup and was shocked to get an initial diagnosis that I had mantle cell lymphoma. And I went through intensive chemotherapy through the summer of 2020, and was fortunate to go into remission. But this, through this process, gave me a lot of time to reflect and think. I wasn't in a state physically when I could be working in the studio, but I could think a lot about what I wanted to do in the future, what I had been doing, what was really meaningful to me. And lymphoma, if you're familiar, often does come back after remission. And so in that recurrence, I qualified for a gene therapy treatment with you can see photographed here, in November of 21. And fortunately, since then, I've been in total remission. So it's really a miraculous sci-fi kind of treatment. And doctors are reluctant to ever use the word cured, but it really is technology that is life-changing and has been a phenomenal experience through me. So this is the first piece that I made when I was able to return in the studio. And if you're not familiar with the Turkish term nazar bonju, it's their idea of evil eye and warding off those kinds of negative gazes and jealousy and things like that. And so this was also my first piece in the morality series. And it was also my first piece incorporating a sculpted fantasy pewter miniature into finished artworks, I guess since I was, 12 or 13 years old. And so this is, you can kind of see that monster greedily lusting after the other jewels and gems that are tube set within that belt buckle piece. And it also, I really had been thinking a lot about humanity's relationship to nature and using kind of the lens of our history with aquatic themes as a focus point for that. And this second piece in the morality series is also the piece that I have included in the paper Alchemy series. But you can see taking on that deadly sin of greed, and you could see that small miniature. Now I don't sculpt the miniatures, but I do work very hard to meticulously hand paint them, and you can see the skeletons of the greedy pirates going after the treasure and connecting that with the layered Thurmanite maps. So you think of kind of treasure maps and digging through different layers. And so this started to really combine a lot of different processes and processy materials that I was interested in, with the metal spinning, the metal working, jewelry techniques like tube setting, bringing the miniatures into the finished pieces, cold joining, things like that. And I do want to just give some credit here. And you may or may not be familiar with this company. I certainly wasn't before I moved to Denton, Texas, called Reaper Miniatures. But I did learn that it's the largest manufacturer of fantasy miniatures in the United States, has had one of the largest Kickstarter campaigns of any type. And I learned about it through some of my metalsmithing and jewelry students that would work there. And so they do a lot of they do all of their pewter miniature casting in-house there. And since it's right here in Denton, Texas, I started going to their annual convention, even though it wasn't really a world that I was very involved in. But started to become interested again, since it was something I did as a kid, and I thought, well, even though I'm very busy in the studio, it's okay to have a hobby. And so started just painting miniatures again, just for fun, and started taking some classes, and somehow that hobby really just transformed its way into the studio. I started, guess, being less self-conscious about sharing that interest, and just wanted to see how it would play out if it was actually included in finished pieces. And so this teapot, the Wrath of Poseidon, was another one of the Deadly Sin series. And for all the metalsmiths out there, I mean, everybody's got to make teapots at some point through their career, right? And this was just another step towards that convergence of all these different processes and approaches and materials that I was interested in. So you see a lot of the metalworking in there, with some of the fold forming components, incorporating pewter, and I really had to teach myself a lot about that metal, and it is very, very different from working at many of the other high temperature soldering and metals like sterling silver and copper and brass and things like that. And then also getting my skills with miniature painting up to a level where I felt that they were on par with the other processes and techniques that I was using in my finished pieces. And this is another more recent piece, and it was very interesting because the piece itself was about creative problem solving, and I had kind of a design, but I honestly, at the beginning of it, wasn't sure precisely how to make it, and so kind of had to innovate and solve a lot of problems in the process of making it, and revise some things. And so the piece itself, which is about the myth of Pegasus fighting a chimera, and how the creative problem solving of Bellerophon as he threw liquid lead into the mouths of the Chimera and triumphing over the monster and sort of showing creativity as the solution to problems. And it's interesting, the piece was about that and almost became self-referential because of all the creativity necessary to solve the problems that came up with in the piece. I continued to be interested in those ancient myths, storytelling, as well as even digital fabrication. And you can see some of the tributes to that in the base plate for the assembly of the whole piece. And this is another one in the morality series. So this is, I know it looks like a kind of a miniature diorama, but is actually a wearable belt buckle, and has relating to that deadly sin of lust and starting to get a little bit more narrative with my work. So you see different themes of what the man in the scenario might think is going on versus the trap that he might be falling into as well. And you can see some other details of the piece actually being worn, and then the back plate of it as well. And I was, again, with some of those internal conflicts and things, I decided to, be sharing these finished metalworks in the annual miniature competition and convention that Reaper Miniatures hosts, and had no idea how that world might react to these very strange pieces because they're not familiar with jewelry making or metalsmithing techniques necessarily, much more focused on the painting techniques or the assembly techniques of dioramas, and was just stunned to both win gold and silver medals in different categories, considering the little passion play belt buckle as a diorama, and then the open category with the more sculptural approach in the creativity bridge piece. And I just wanted to share one other super recent piece that as of now I still haven't put up on my website, but this is in that series with the first repercussions piece that I opened with. This one's called Duality and was inspired by the story about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the top plate of this piece was actually made from that book, and then you can see the base plate being from maps, sort of showing the different layers of experiences and travels that we might go through, and creating kind of the spun pewter form of the typical Erlenmeyer flask that you might see in different science labs and such. And here's some details of the duality of our psyches, of the maybe more out of control aspects of Mr. Hyde versus the more scientific aspects of Dr. Jekyll. And just a little kind of hidden treat if you do explore the piece and sort of take it apart and realize that the bottom of that spun piece is also hammer formed as well. And I do want to just share that none of this work would have been possible without the support of the University of North Texas, where I've been a faculty member since 2009. And the inspirations and awareness that I've gotten from my students, as well as the opportunities and grants and funding to pursue pieces that maybe aren't the most financially lucrative, but really feed the soul and spirit in my different studio experiments. And if you're interested in learning more about my work, I certainly have my website at jamesthurman.com. And I do maintain a YouTube channel with mostly instructional videos about metal spinning, metalsmithing, and jewelry making, as well as some other recorded lectures and things like this. And probably most regularly, I try and keep up with my Instagram account and post something at least every week of the newest kind of updates that I've been engaged in. So thank you all for your attention, and I hope you've really enjoyed learning a little bit more about my recent works. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you can hear from me when I post future videos. Thanks for stopping by.